It was one of those crisp winter evenings in Seattle, where the city lights danced on the rain-soaked streets, and a biting wind whispered through the narrow alleys. Inside Reed's Gourmet Lounge, the world felt like a different place entirely. The restaurant, known for its luxurious ambiance and impeccable service, radiated a warmth that contrasted sharply with the cold night outside. Crystal chandeliers hung from the high ceilings, casting a golden glow over the room. Tables were set with the finest linens, polished silverware, and glimmering wine glasses, creating an air of sophistication that left no doubt about the exclusivity of the place. Waiters weaved through the crowded dining room with practiced elegance, balancing trays laden with culinary masterpieces. The faint sound of a piano playing in the background added to the atmosphere, turning the restaurant into a haven for the city's elite. But tonight, beneath all the beauty and refinement, an unspoken tension simmered in the air. At the center of it all was a table near the window where three women sat. They were dressed impeccably, their laughter cutting through the soft murmur of the restaurant. At the head of the group was Isabella Harper, a woman whose presence demanded attention. Her dark hair was styled to perfection, and her designer dress shimmered subtly under the lights. Expensive diamond earrings adorned her ears, and a gold bracelet rested on her wrist, its brilliance matching the icy confidence in her eyes. To Isabella, life was simple. Some people were meant to serve, and others, like her, were meant to rule. And tonight she was ready to make sure everyone knew where they stood. Across the room, a young waitress named Lily Parker was hard at work. At first glance, Lily might have seemed out of place in such an opulent setting. Her uniform, though perfectly pressed, couldn't hide the exhaustion etched into her features. She moved quickly yet carefully, her every step a delicate dance of composure and determination. Lily had a dream. She wanted to go to college and build a better life for herself. But dreams cost money, and money came from nights like this. As Lily carried a tray of water glasses toward Isabella's table, she felt the familiar weight of tiredness tugging at her legs. Just as she approached, her foot snagged slightly on the corner of the plush carpet. The tray wobbled in her hands, the glasses clinking together. Though nothing spilled, the moment didn't go unnoticed. Isabella's sharp eyes caught the stumble, and her lips curled into a smirk. "Unbelievable," Isabella muttered, loud enough for her companions to hear. "Do they not train their staff any more?" Her friends giggled, their laughter laced with mockery. Lily steadied herself and placed the glasses on the table, her cheeks burning with embarrassment. "I apologize, ma'am," she said softly, her voice steady despite the lump forming in her throat. Isabella leaned back in her chair, tapping a manicured finger on the edge of her glass. To her, Lily wasn't a person, just another nameless face in a sea of workers who existed to serve her. People like Lily, she thought, were only worth noticing when they messed up. The tension escalated when Lily returned moments later with their meals. Balancing 3 plates on her arms, she approached the table with as much grace as she could muster. "Here you are, ladies," she said, her tone polite but subdued. "I hope you enjoy your dinner." Isabella barely glanced at the plate before wrinkling her nose. "Is this what you call medium rare?" she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It looks overcooked. And why did it take so long? Were you taking a nap in the kitchen?" Lily opened her mouth to apologize, but Isabella waved a hand dismissively. "Don't bother. It's not that hard to get an order right, is it?" Her friends burst into laughter, clearly enjoying the spectacle. Around them, other diners shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A few exchanged glances, their expressions a mix of sympathy for Lily and disapproval for Isabella. But Isabella didn't notice or didn't care. She was too busy reveling in her performance. Across the room, a man in a simple gray suit watched silently. Alexander Reed, the restaurant's owner, was known for his quiet strength and unwavering principles. Though he often preferred to remain in the background, his keen eyes missed nothing. Tonight, as he observed the scene unfolding at Isabella's table, something inside him stirred. Lily's hands trembled as she picked up Isabella's plate. "I'll have the chef remake it for you, ma'am," she said, her voice barely audible. "See that you do," Isabella replied coldly. Then, turning to her friends, she added, "Honestly, they'll hire anyone these days. How hard is it to carry food without almost dropping it?" The words hit Lily like a slap. She kept her head down, blinking back tears as she made her way to the kitchen. She had dealt with difficult customers before, but there was something particularly cruel about Isabella's words. It wasn't just the insult, it was the way she laughed, as though Lily's pain was nothing more than entertainment. As Isabella continued to mock Lily, "Did you see how she walked? Like she could barely stand." Alexander stood from his seat. His movements were deliberate, his expression unreadable. He walked quietly toward the manager, leaning in to speak. The manager's eyes widened slightly at whatever Alexander said, and he nodded quickly, heading toward the kitchen. Meanwhile, Isabella leaned back in her chair, utterly unaware of what was about to unfold. She started bragging about her latest vacation, her voice carrying through the room. "The Maldives are beautiful this time of year," she said, twirling her glass of wine. "You should see the villa I stayed in. Absolute paradise. Have you ever seen someone act like this? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts in the comments below." Lily stepped into the kitchen, her chest tightening with every shaky breath. The warm hum of the restaurant's bustling staff was drowned out by the echoes of Isabella's biting words still ringing in her ears. She set the rejected plate down carefully on the counter, her hands trembling. The sous chef glanced up at her, concern etched on his face, but Lily couldn't meet his gaze. Instead, she gripped the edge of the counter, trying to steady herself. "This isn't the first rude customer you've dealt with," she whispered to herself, as if the words might somehow numb the sting. But tonight felt different. Isabella's cruelty had cut deeper, not just because of her words, but because of the laughter that followed. It was as though her dignity had been stripped away, and no one in the room had come to her defense. In that moment, Lily thought about why she had taken this job in the first place. She could almost hear her mother's voice. "You're stronger than you think, sweetheart. Dreams don't come easy, but they're worth fighting for." Those words had carried her through long nights and early mornings, but now they felt distant, like a faint memory slipping through her fingers. She blinked hard, fighting back tears. "You can't cry here," she told herself, "not in front of everyone." Meanwhile, out in the dining room, Alexander Reed watched everything unfold with a heavy heart. He had always taken pride in the way his restaurant treated both customers and staff, with respect, kindness, and dignity. But tonight, seeing Lily retreat to the kitchen, her shoulders hunched like she was carrying the weight of the world, he felt an anger he rarely allowed himself to feel. Alexander had grown up knowing what it meant to be underestimated. As a young man, he had worked as a dishwasher, scrubbing pots and pans until his hands bled. Back then, People like Isabella would look right through him, treating him as if he were invisible, or worse, like he was beneath them. It was those experiences that had shaped his values and inspired him to build a place like Reed's Gourmet Lounge, where everyone mattered, no matter their role. But now, watching Isabella bask in her self-importance while Lily suffered in silence, Alexander realized it was time to step in. He wasn't just a restaurant owner tonight. He was a witness to something deeply wrong, and he couldn't let it go unchallenged. Lily returned from the kitchen a few moments later, her face pale but composed. She carried a new plate for Isabella, her movements careful and deliberate. Placing it gently in front of her, she said, "Here you are, ma'am. The chef prepared this fresh for you. I hope it's to your liking." Isabella didn't even bother to look up. She picked up her fork and inspected the dish with exaggerated disdain. "I suppose it's acceptable," she said after a pause, her tone indifferent. Then, with a smirk, she added, "But next time, try not to make us wait so long. And really, work on your balance. You're making this place look bad." Lily stood there for a moment, frozen. Her lips parted slightly, as if she wanted to say something. But what could she say? She had already apologized, already done everything she could to make things right. And yet, it still wasn't enough. Nearby, other diners had stopped pretending not to notice. Some exchanged hushed whispers, while others stared openly at Isabella, their faces a mix of shock and disapproval. A young couple seated at a nearby table looked particularly upset. The woman leaned toward her partner and murmured, "She's just trying to do her job. Why is she being so cruel?" Isabella, of course, remained blissfully unaware. Or perhaps she simply didn't care. She sipped her wine and began talking about her latest luxury purchase, her voice loud enough to carry across the room. "You wouldn't believe the size of the diamonds on this necklace," she said, gesturing to the glittering chain around her neck. "Custom made, of course. I mean, why settle for anything less?" Alexander Reed stood quietly at the edge of the dining room, his hands clasped in front of him. He watched as Lily walked away from Isabella's table, her head held high despite the tears threatening to spill over. For a moment, he hesitated. Confronting a customer, especially one like Isabella, wasn't something he did lightly. But tonight wasn't about avoiding discomfort or keeping the peace. Tonight was about doing what was right. He approached the manager, speaking in a low voice. The manager's eyes widened as Alexander explained what he wanted to do, but he nodded quickly, clearly understanding the gravity of the situation. As Alexander prepared to step forward, his thoughts drifted back to Lily. He remembered seeing the determination in her eyes during her interview, the way she had spoken about her dreams of going to college and making something of herself. She had reminded him of himself all those years ago, a young person fighting against the odds, refusing to give up despite the challenges. And now, she was being torn down by someone who couldn't see beyond her own privilege. It wasn't just about Lily anymore. It was about everyone who had ever been treated as less than, everyone who had ever been made to feel small by people like Isabella Harper. And tonight, Alexander was going to make sure she learned a lesson she would never forget. Have you ever been in a situation where you had to stand up for someone? What did you do? Let us know in the comments. The restaurant buzzed softly with murmurs as Alexander Reed walked toward Isabella's table. His steps were calm, deliberate, and unhurried. Yet There was an air of quiet authority about him that made heads turn. The once muted whispers of the diners grew louder as they realized who he was, the man who had built this restaurant from the ground up. Isabella, still engrossed in her monologue about luxury vacations, didn't notice him approach. Her laughter was loud, sharp, and devoid of warmth, the kind of laughter that made the room feel colder. Her friends listened, nodding along, though their expressions seemed strained, as if they weren't quite sure how to respond anymore. Alexander stopped just short of their table, his presence commanding but unthreatening. "Excuse me, ladies," he said, his voice low and steady, yet carrying the weight of a man who expected to be heard. Isabella's laughter halted abruptly. She turned her head slowly, her perfectly arched eyebrows rising in mild annoyance. "Yes?" she asked, her tone laced with impatience, as if she had been interrupted during something far more important. "My name is Alexander Reed," he said, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I'm the owner of this establishment." For the first time that evening, Isabella's confident facade faltered. Her friends exchanged uneasy glances, their discomfort evident. "Oh," Isabella said, her voice softening just a fraction. "Well, it's a pleasure to meet you, Mr. Reed. Your restaurant is lovely." "Thank you," Alexander replied, his tone polite but firm. "I'm glad you think so. However, I couldn't help but notice the way you've been treating one of my staff members tonight." The entire restaurant seemed to hold its breath. Forks paused mid-air. Glasses were set down quietly, and all eyes turned to the table near the window. Isabella shifted in her seat, her confidence visibly cracking under the weight of Alexander's steady gaze. Well, I wasn't trying to be rude," she stammered. "It's just the service wasn't exactly—" Alexander raised a hand gently, silencing her. "Ms. Harper," he began, his voice unwavering, "I built this restaurant on the principle that everyone who walks through these doors, whether they're a guest or a staff member, deserves to be treated with respect and dignity. That principle is non-negotiable." Isabella's face flushed crimson, her earlier bravado now replaced with visible discomfort. Her friends looked down at their plates, clearly unwilling to meet Alexander's piercing gaze. "I understand that you're accustomed to a certain standard of living," Alexander continued, "but being wealthy doesn't give anyone the right to demean others. Lily Parker is one of the hardest working people I've ever met. She's balancing long hours here while saving for college, and she still manages to serve every guest with grace and professionalism." A ripple of quiet agreement swept through the restaurant as diners nodded, some even murmuring words of approval. Isabella sat frozen, her mouth slightly open, but no words came out. "And yet," Alexander added, his tone softening slightly, "tonight you chose to humiliate her. For what? For a momentary feeling of superiority? For a laugh at her expense? That's not the kind of behavior we tolerate here." Lily had stepped out from the kitchen just in time to hear Alexander's words. She stood near the edge of the dining room, her heart pounding. She wanted to speak up, to tell him he didn't have to do this, but her feet refused to move. A small part of her felt overwhelmed by gratitude, while another part felt an ache she couldn't quite put into words. Isabella swallowed hard, her eyes darting around the room. She could feel the weight of every gaze on her, their silent judgment pressing down on her like a physical force. "I didn't mean any harm," she muttered, though even she didn't believe the words. Alexander tilted his head slightly, studying her. "Harm isn't always intentional, Miss Harper," he said, "but its effects are still the same. That's why it's so important to think about how we treat others." For a moment, there was silence. Then Alexander gestured to a waiter who approached the table with a bottle of champagne and an envelope. Isabella's brow furrowed in confusion as the envelope was placed in front of her. "What is this?" she asked, her voice shaky. Alexander smiled faintly, but there was no humor in it. "This," he said, "is the cost of your meal tonight. But instead of you paying for it, I've decided to donate the entire amount to a fund we've established to help young workers like Lily achieve their dreams. Because, Ms. Harper, while your money can buy many things, it will never buy the right to treat someone as if they're less than human." The room erupted in quiet applause. It wasn't the loud, raucous kind that filled stadiums, but a steady, heartfelt acknowledgement of Alexander's words. Isabella looked down at the envelope, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of her actions was beginning to settle on her shoulders, and for the first time that evening, she seemed truly speechless. Lily stood in the corner, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. She wasn't sure whether to feel vindicated, embarrassed, or simply overwhelmed. All she knew was that Alexander's words had reached something deep within her, a place she hadn't realized was so broken. As the applause died down, Alexander turned to address the rest of the restaurant. "We are all here for different reasons," he said, his voice carrying across the room. "But no matter who we are or where we come from, kindness costs nothing. It's a gift we can all afford to give." The room was silent for a moment, and then someone at a nearby table murmured, "He's right." Others nodded in agreement, and the atmosphere in the restaurant seemed to shift, becoming lighter, warmer. The applause faded, leaving a quiet hum of reflection in its wake. Isabella Harper sat frozen in her chair, her usual confidence now replaced with an unfamiliar and uncomfortable vulnerability. She stared at the envelope on the table, its presence heavier than any piece of jewelry she wore that night. For the first time in years, she felt exposed, not as the wealthy, glamorous woman she had worked so hard to present to the world, but as something much smaller, much less certain. Her friends fidgeted in awkward silence, their earlier laughter now a distant memory. One of them reached out, placing a hand gently on Isabella's arm, but even that small gesture did little to lift the weight of the moment. Across the room, Lily Parker watched from her quiet corner, her emotions swirling like a storm. Gratitude mixed with disbelief, and for a moment she wondered if she was dreaming. Alexander Reed's words had felt like a shield protecting her from the sharp edges of the world, but they had also unearthed something fragile within her, a sense of worth she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time. Alexander stepped back, his expression calm and resolute. He turned toward Lily, his eyes softening as he motioned for her to join him. The room seemed to hold its breath as Lily hesitated, her feet rooted to the floor. Finally, she took a shaky step forward, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. When she reached him, Alexander smiled warmly. "Lily," he said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet strength that made her feel seen, truly seen. "You've shown remarkable grace tonight, more than most could manage under the circumstances. It's people like you who remind me why I built this restaurant in the first place." Lily blinked rapidly, willing the tears in her eyes not to fall. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was just doing my job." Alexander shook his head gently. "No, Lily, what you did tonight was more than just a job. You showed resilience, kindness, and strength when it would have been easier to give up. That's something no amount of money can buy." The room erupted into another round of applause, this time louder, more heartfelt. Lily's cheeks flushed, and for the first time that night, she allowed herself a small, genuine smile. As the applause subsided, Alexander turned back to the diners. "Tonight, we've all been reminded of something important," he said, his voice resonating with a quiet authority. "It's easy to get caught up in our own lives, to forget that the people around us, the waiters, the chefs, the busboys, the strangers on the street, are just as human as we are. They have dreams, struggles, and stories that we might never know. And it's up to us to choose kindness, no matter our differences." His words hung in the air, filling the room with a sense of unity and understanding. Diners exchanged glances, some nodding, others wiping at their eyes. For a moment, the restaurant felt like more than just a place to eat. It felt like a community. Isabella Harper sat silently through it all, her hands resting in her lap. The weight of Alexander's words pressed heavily on her chest, forcing her to confront truths she had long ignored. She thought about the way she had laughed at Lily, the way she had dismissed her, as if she didn't matter. And for the first time in a long time, Isabella felt ashamed, not the fleeting embarrassment of being called out in public, but a deeper, more profound sense of regret. "I'm sorry," she whispered suddenly, her voice barely audible. Her friends looked at her, startled, but she didn't meet their eyes. Instead, she turned toward Lily, who stood a few feet away, still unsure of how to process everything that had happened. "Lily, I'm sorry for the way I treated you. I was wrong." The room fell silent once more. Isabella's words, though quiet, carried an unexpected sincerity. For a moment, Lily didn't know how to respond. Part of her wanted to hold on to her anger, to let Isabella feel the sting of her actions. But as she looked at the woman before her, no longer confident, no longer invincible, Lily felt something else, compassion. "It's okay," Lily said finally, her voice soft but steady. "Thank you for saying that." The tension in the room began to dissolve, replaced by a warmth that felt almost tangible. Diners resumed their meals, but the energy was different now, softer, kinder. Some leaned over to thank their servers, while others left generous tips. A few even approached Lily on their way out, offering words of encouragement that brought fresh tears to her eyes. As the night wound down, Isabella quietly gathered her things and left with her friends. Outside, the cold air hit her like a slap, but for the first time she didn't retreat into her usual cocoon of self-importance. Instead, she walked slowly, her thoughts racing. She didn't know if she could change overnight, but for the first time she wanted to try. Inside, Lily finished her shift with a renewed sense of purpose. The words Alexander had spoken stayed with her, like a light guiding her forward. When the last table was cleared and the restaurant finally emptied, she took a deep breath and stepped outside. The crisp night air felt different now, less harsh, more alive. Alexander stood by the door, his coat draped over his arm. He smiled as Lily approached. "Good night, Lily," he said warmly. "Good night, Mr. Reed," she replied. Then, after a moment, she added, "And thank you for everything." As she walked away, The stars above seemed to shine just a little brighter, as if the world itself had been softened by the events of the night. Kindness costs nothing but means everything. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs to remember that treating others with respect is always the right choice, and let us know in the comments. What does kindness mean to you? The end.